Well, let's get to our first topic of discussion today. Now, the level of frustration faced by Nigerians over worsening power supply problems lately is better imagined than experienced. Following the particular collapse of the nation's grid, the fourth time, I beg your pardon, this year, coupled with constraints of procuring gas to run some of the power plants. Now, the situation has adversely impacted industrial productivity and worsened unemployment as the cost of production now escalates, causing manufacturers to struggle to make profit margin due to the rising costs in the price of diesel in the past weeks. I beg your pardon. Aside from the grid collapse, Nigerians have been witnessing insufficient electricity supply with millions of homes in darkness. This is because the nation generates less than 20% of electricity it needs and can't even transmit and effectively distribute the little it generates. Well, let's get talking today about this because it remains very topical and looking at all of the issues that surrounds the electricity supply chain in the country. I have joining me via Zoom. He's an energy lawyer and, of course, an energy analyst, a writer, of course, Dr. Ayo De Leoni. It's good to see you, Dr. Oni. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.
Dr. Oni, let's start this way. It's becoming a recurrent decimal, having collapse upon collapse of our grid. And we keep getting press releases from the Ministry of Power saying vandalism, shortage of gas, and all of that. Now, first, you are a professional in this space. What does this mean? Why are we facing this? Is it lack of maintenance? Is it lack of investment?
Thank you very much. It's a number of issues. You've mentioned a few of them already. Vandalism, insufficient investment over a long period of time, even implementation of a good market design. This is how it works. When you have a grid, you have energy, that's power that is generated. You would have capacity to fill the gap in the future as the population grows. You would have a market for what is known as ancillary services, such that you would have things like spinning reserves. You have things like black start. Spinning reserves, for example, where there's a drop in frequency, there can be something that immediately replaces that. So there's a problem with the market design, particularly its implementation. Maybe the design isn't so much of a problem because there isn't that market for ancillary services, and there have been arguments as to who should pay for ancillary services. That's another thing from a technical point of view. Also, like you had mentioned, vandalism. The last collapse was as a result of vandalism. And between 1987, for almost 30 years, there was no major enhancement of the grid in the country. And when you speak to the national grid, you speak to a network of transmission lines that connect generating units to load being energy used by you and I and by industry. So it's hydra-headed. Also from the commercial standpoint too, you will see issues around gas pricing, inability of the gencos to pay for gas. And if you don't pay for gas, remember that for the grid to be stable, it must work within certain limits. The quantity of power that passes through demand and supply must almost balance out. If they don't, because a number of generating plants cannot generate electricity because they don't have gas, then you continue to have the same problems. And that's from a commercial standpoint. So it's hydra-headed. And of course, SCADA issues around emergency management are also problems. So it's several problems.
Several problems. Indeed. The discos, the gencos, TCN, everyone continues to maintain positions, and most times they trade blames and they say, yes, we need to come to a round table to identify these issues and get them sorted once and for all. Do you think this issue is around policy? Is it around regulation or around management? We thought after privatization, this was going to be stories. We're just going to move forward. But we're still hovering between 4,000 and 4,500 megawatts for a country of 200 million people, for crying out loud.
Yes. The rule of thumb is 1 megawatt for 1,000 people. So you can imagine the quantum of electricity we need. So the problem is mostly implementation, to be honest. We have a lot of very brilliant and smart Nigerians, but the problem has always been implementation. And the problem is also at times issues around the blame game. So you find out that if you even go back, the privatization itself was a brilliant idea, but implementation also was a problem. You know, you had a number of guys coming who probably didn't have sufficient resources, or maybe even the privatization should have been done differently, where people were just to deposit money, which would then be used to enhance the system, rather than the money going straight to government for other things. You know, so people spent money, borrowed money to buy these assets, and now cannot run them properly because no one is willing to invest because of the entire issues around illiquidity. Because no one wants to lend a disco money when they are not sure the disco will be able to pay them back. So it becomes a problem. You know, you have infrastructure that is outdated, that is malfunctional, but you don't have finances to improve. So it's been all sorts from the transmission companies saying that the distribution companies were refusing to take power. Now you then go to the consumers. They were refusing to take power certain instances because they did not have sufficient infrastructure. In other instances, in those areas, they don't pay for electricity. So why take electricity that people are not going to pay for, and the disco, would still need to pay the GENCO and the transmission company and embed and everybody else who gets paid across the value chain. So it's a problem everyone has a fault in, even consumers who steal electricity, you know, and the distribution companies too. At times you want to do deals with them and they make it very difficult. I'm not saying it's every one of them, but it's a problem across the value chain. So it's important, maybe everyone sits down and everyone agrees there are rules, and everyone then decides that the rules need to be implemented. NERC is doing great in certain areas around implementation. I'm not exactly sure where they stand. So it's hydra-headed from policies, not so bad, but from implementation mostly. That's where our problems are.
Dr. Oni, I'm still going to talk around customers, and of course, they relate mostly with the discos, so that will be customers disco relationship as we move on in this conversation. But you are an energy lawyer. I'm not a lawyer, but I like to ask, according to my own research, the 1999 Constitution and National Power Policy of 2001 provides that power generation and transmission, and of course distribution, is a shared responsibility between federal and state governments. But that's not what is happening. Are they giving them that power? Some states can do well. Look at Lagos, for example. Why can't we decentralize this once and for all?
Okay, good point around decentralization. I'm an advocate for energy federalism. I'm an advocate for each state having its own system. However, you want to be sure you are not replicating the same problem. So if the national grid can have problems, it means a state grid can have similar problems if it's a large state, if you don't understand the problems properly and are willing to deal with them. That said, I think it's a step in the right direction. Electricity is in the concurrent legislative list of the Constitution. It says that, depending on how you look at it, for now, states only have powers to legislate on distribution. They don't have, or in areas they can legislate on generation in areas where the national grid doesn't get to. The question then is, a place like Lagos, where would you say you do not have the national grid? So, say for distribution, but I understand that there are moves to modify, to amend the Constitution. And when that is done, I believe states like Edo, Lagos should make progress. Even on those states would make a lot of progress. Now, the problem is then with those who don't have the capacity. But I guess that's what federalism then does. Then the federal government can step in and support those other states.
Brilliant stuff. Now, let's now talk about improvement before I go back to customer discrimination, because that's also very important to me. Investment is what is expected even from the investors that came in to take over after privatization exercise. Do you think that enough of investment is being, done from both sides? Investors, federal government. central bank has been coming in. We've seen all that's been happening. Someone even sent a press release this morning saying that there should be an audit of expenses in the power sector in recent times. Now, do you think that on both sides they are fulfilling their part of that agreement? That's on the investor side and on government side.
Okay, on the government side, government has been doing a lot. Now, the question for me is whether you are just throwing money at the problem or you understand the problem.
True.
And even when you spend, are you spending sufficiently? You might not even be able to afford it. So government is trying its bit, but from the investor side, remember what I said the problem was? The problem is the bankability of the entire system. If the system is not bankable, you're not going to get loans. No one's going to lend you money to be able to do those deals. You understand? No one's going to lend you money to be able to do those deals. So the investors aren't putting enough and cannot even get enough unless the issues around the illiquidity in the market are resolved. And quite a number of people know what to do. It's just, at times, you say it's the Nigerian factor. Implementation and getting those things done. And you know, when certain decisions are going to be taken from the government side of view, it's the issue of policy versus politics at times, and the tendency to always elevate politics ahead of policy. So I think that's what it is. I would think at times some of government's investments shouldn't be the case because the sector has been largely privatized. Of course, transmission hasn't. What you had initially was a management contract with Manitoba Hydro International. But generally speaking, it should be the generation companies and the transmission distribution companies investing. Of course, our government should be investing in transmission, and I see that that's already going on. But much more needs to be done quicker.
All right. At the end of the day, we are doing about 3,000, sometimes 4,000. I think at the peak, at the time, we got to about 5,000, according to TCN. And they say we have the capacity to do more than that. But that now comes to distributing this little megawatts that we have. Of course, that's what we can generate. And the issue of billings now coming, that's on the disco sides. Then we have estimated billings for those that don't have meters. And the issue of metering also comes in. So which comes first? Discos will tell you that they need a cost reflective tariff for them to be able to break even. So you can see that, like you said, it's really hydra-headed. Where do we stand in all of this? The little that is being supplied, how can we adequately account for it?
Okay, good point. So everyone just needs to play their role. You and I need to pay for electricity because first, if you and I don't pay, nothing else works. Because you and I, factories, industries, pay the discos. The discos then distribute fictionally that the funds. So everybody else, generation companies can pay gas companies. So first, the pricing has to be right. And the pricing is reasonable now. It's just that you have a band system such that those who pay what they ought to pay or nearly what they ought to pay are those who get 20 to 24 hours or 18 to 24 hours. But the question is whether there really are people who get that much power. So those guys pay the highest, then the next set, and then those who get 8 hours or less barely pay any, don't pay much. So it's an incentivized system, a system that incentivizes distribution networks to ensure that people get power. But if there's a problem with once it's a network, it's a system. Once you have a problem with one part of the system, it affects everybody else. If the distribution companies don't get electricity via the transmission company and the generation companies can't generate, then it's a problem. So it's distribution, very important. Metering is important, and pricing. For me, those are the start points. I always say that generation isn't a problem. If everyone who wants to invest in generation sees that the distribution companies can generate enough funds, can collect enough, and have a reduced aggregate technical, commercial, and collection risk, loss, rather, if those losses reduce substantially, you see a lot of people invest in generation. I know a lot of people and a lot of clients speak to me about investing in generation. But when they look at the entire value chain, it becomes a tough sell. So the problem for me is more distribution and transmission. If And if metering, and that's why government is doing a lot around metering, because if you incentivize metering by saying you don't get anything if there's no electricity, it's then an incentive for distribution companies to ensure that there's electricity. That's when they meter, and that's when they generate revenue. So it's down up from you and I to the distribution company. But that said, if there's a problem, even with transmission, it affects everything else. So once there's a problem across the value chain, it's a value chain, it affects everything else. So I hope that does provide some of the answer.
Yeah, perfect. Shortage of gas and all of that. Are we looking at other sources? Let's wrap up on that note, particularly at this time where we're talking about clean energy.
Okay, that's interesting. Nigeria has always had a number of policies around renewable energy. For example, if you look at our multi-year tariff order, at some point, the concept of a refit, renewable energy feeding tariff, was introduced. It was probably the highest in the world, or one of the highest in the world, to incentivize people to invest. At the time, there was a policy of 20% by 2020, 20% of electricity generated, or 20,000 megawatts or something, 20%, I think, should be renewable. Then it moved to 30% by 2030. So we had those policies. Like I told you, the issue is not policy, it's implementation. We have a number of utility-sized solar projects that PPAs were signed in 2016, initial in 2016, and they've not come on stream because of a number of issues with the government around put call option, naira dollar debates, guarantee that they'll get paid. Even the tariff was a problem at some point. So it's still the same issues around liquidity, whether the discos can get their money and then pay the generation companies. So if we and to even resolve the grid issues, to make it stronger, you need a strong complement, a robust complement of renewables, fossil fuel power, gas, and all of that. So, and it's something you hear a lot being said about by government, and particularly for solar home systems. It's something you probably have solar panels in your house. It's something everyone is doing, but of course, the initial outlay is quite substantial, and then the question is whether you can use that to power industrialization. So I think quite a bit is being done. We've got good policies around renewables. It's just ensuring implementation and ensuring that everyone does work together to succeed.
Brilliant conversation there with you. I've been talking to energy lawyer and analyst Dr. Ayodele Oni. Thank you so much for making sense of all of these issues surrounding Nigeria's power sector. Do enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you very much for having me.